You probably think royal life was all velvet pillows and golden palaces, power, beauty, luxury. But if you woke up tomorrow as a woman inside the Ottoman Sultan's harem, your chances of surviving past your 30th birthday would drop to nearly zero. Behind the marble walls of Topkapi Palace was a prison wrapped in silk, where your own body could become a death sentence, and your beauty your curse. Here, a silver tray didn't serve tea. It selected who would live and who would quietly disappear. This is not the romantic fantasy you saw in TV dramas. This is the terrifying reality the history books tried to bury. Welcome to the most beautiful nightmare in human history. When people hear the word harem, their imagination usually drifts towards scenes of exotic beauty, women in flowing silks, golden chambers decorated with intricate tiles, and the sultan strolling through a world of elegance and desire. But the reality was far more sinister, because the Ottoman harem was not a paradise, it was a prison. It was a carefully designed system that looked dazzling on the outside, but rotted with cruelty within. Every corridor of Topkapi Palace whispered with fear. Every jeweled doorway hid screams that never reached the streets of Istanbul. The harem, at its heart, was a machine created to consume women, to use them as pawns in politics, vessels for heirs, and ornaments of power. The irony was almost unbearable. The same women who were dressed in the most expensive silks were treated as if they were disposable property, purchased and discarded like commodities in the empire's greatest marketplace of flesh. Inside these palace walls lived hundreds of women, most of them brought in from across the empire and beyond its borders. They were Greek, Circassian, Ukrainian, Albanian, Bosnian, Georgian, girls snatched in slave raids, traded in distant markets, or given as gifts to curry favor with the Sultan. The moment they entered the palace, their lives as individuals ended. They were stripped of their names, their faiths, their families, and given new identities crafted to please the empire. They were told that they had been chosen for privilege, that they were stepping into a life of luxury. Yet the truth was far more terrifying. This was a place where the walls glittered with gold while hiding suffocating despair, where every smile offered to the Sultan concealed the trembling of a heart that knew it was living on borrowed time, where a woman's youth was currency, her obedience was survival, and her slightest mistake could mean a silent execution in the dead of night. The system was designed to appear orderly, even civilized, but it was in reality a structure of absolute control. The women were trained in language, poetry, music, and dance not to enrich their own lives, but to become more valuable tools in service to the Sultan. Every gesture, every glance, every word spoken in those gilded halls was monitored, catalogued, and judged by eunuchs who had themselves been mutilated and transformed into guardians of this empire of shadows. The hierarchy inside the harem was cruelly precise. At the bottom were the youngest girls, some barely in their teens, terrified and uncertain of what awaited them. Above them were concubines who had survived the first brutal years, hardened and cautious, always watching for opportunities but equally aware that envy and betrayal were constant companions. At the very top stood the Valid Sultan, the Sultan's mother, wielding immense power, but only because she had outlived the system and learned to master it. For every woman who rose, countless others disappeared, their stories erased, their lives reduced to a line in the palace's cold ledgers: relocated, illness, accident. Words that sanitized horror. What made the harem truly terrifying was not only the executions or the punishments, but the atmosphere of endless uncertainty. A woman could spend years perfecting her art, learning to sing, dance, and entertain, believing that patience and discipline would guarantee her survival, only to discover that survival was never promised. To be chosen by the Sultan was both a dream and a nightmare, a chance to rise to influence, but also a risk of destruction. Pregnancy without permission, illness at the wrong time, or a perceived lack of purity could erase her existence overnight. Even those who bore the Sultan's children lived under a permanent shadow, because their survival was tied not only to their own obedience, but also to the political intrigues that swirled like poison through the palace. A prince too promising could doom his mother. A whisper of rebellion could turn love into a death sentence. The palace did not need visible chains, because its entire structure was designed to keep women bound in fear. The harem functioned with the precision of a bureaucracy, and this is what makes it so chilling. This was not random cruelty. This was cruelty with paperwork, cruelty with a system, cruelty that presented itself as tradition and necessity. Every new arrival was recorded, every lesson in obedience scheduled, every potential punishment written down as though it were nothing more than a line in an account book. Behind the beauty of its mosaics and fountains, the harem was one of the most sophisticated prisons in history. Its walls were high, but it did not need guards at every door, because the fear it created kept the women in place. Many never even attempted to escape. Where could they go? Their families were gone, their names were gone, their pasts erased. To the outside world, they no longer existed. The empire had claimed them completely, body and soul. What textbooks rarely admit is that the Ottoman harem was not an accident of history, nor a simple extension of royal privilege. It was an institution perfected over centuries, deliberately crafted to serve the empire's needs. It was not just about pleasing the sultan. It was about ensuring political stability, controlling succession, and preventing alliances that could threaten the throne. By cutting women off from marriage outside the palace, the Ottomans eliminated the possibility of rival families gaining influence through queens or princesses. The harem kept women trapped so that their only loyalty, their only identity, their only future was tied to the sultan alone. In this way, the palace became not only a prison, but also a machine of dynastic survival, a machine that fed on the hopes, fears, and lives of countless women. And yet, even knowing all this, it is difficult to grasp the psychological weight carried by those women who walked its corridors every day. Imagine waking each morning in a chamber decorated with silk and jewels, knowing that those very luxuries were nothing more than decorations for your cage. Imagine eating feasts from golden plates while your stomach twisted with fear that tonight your name might be called, and that would be the last night you would ever see. Imagine hearing the muffled sobs of another woman being dragged away, knowing that tomorrow it could be you. This was not a paradise. This was not romance. This was survival inside a palace of silk and shadows. The beauty was real, but so was the terror. And in that collision between luxury and fear, the Ottoman harem became one of the most terrifying prisons history has ever known. As the sun dipped behind the skyline of Istanbul and the muezzin's call to prayer faded into the distance, an entirely different ritual began to unfold inside the harem, one that turned every sunset into a spectacle of dread. It was known simply as the nightly selection, yet to the women who lived within those glittering walls, it was nothing short of a death lottery. The system looked simple, even elegant to an outsider, but in truth it was a psychological weapon of mass destruction, a process designed not only to determine who would share the sultan's chambers that night, but also to remind every woman that her fate rested not in her own hands, but in the cold efficiency of palace tradition. It was this ritual, repeated endlessly over centuries, that transformed the harem into a stage where hope and horror danced together under the glow of oil lamps, and where the price of survival was measured not in strength or talent, but in sheer luck against a system stacked to consume those who played it. At the center of this ritual was the infamous silver tray, a gleaming object that outwardly symbolized wealth and refinement, but in reality carried the weight of life and death. Upon this tray were placed slips of parchment, each inscribed with the name of a concubine, her entire existence reduced to fragile ink strokes that could summon her to ecstasy, to terror, or to oblivion. The sultan himself often had no direct hand in this choice, preferring to maintain a distance that absolved him of personal responsibility, leaving the eunuchs, men mutilated and enslaved into lifelong servitude, to carry out the selection. They moved through the harem halls in procession, guards clearing the way, the women standing in rigid rows as if awaiting judgment before a merciless deity. For the women, hearing their name read aloud was a moment of unbearable duality. Outwardly they were forced to smile, to bow gracefully, to pretend gratitude, while inwardly their stomachs twisted with dread, for being chosen did not guarantee elevation. It often marked the beginning of the end. The terrifying truth was that selection was not a prize but a test, and one that could not be passed by willpower alone. If a woman happened to be menstruating when her name was called, her natural cycle became her death warrant. Palace records speak coldly of sudden illnesses, but behind those euphemisms lay the reality of strangulation before dawn, of bodies quietly removed through secret corridors, of whispers among servants who dared not say too much. If a woman was found to be barren after repeated visits, she too became a liability, an unwanted ornament who was sooner or later discarded. Even those who conceived were not always safe, for a child not favored by the Sultan could doom its mother to disappearance. The silver tray did not carry opportunity, it carried doom dressed in ritual, and the cruelest part of it all was the forced gratitude. Women compelled to appear honored even as their hearts raced with terror at what awaited them behind the jeweled doors of the Sultan's chambers. The process did not end with selection. In fact, that was only the beginning of the ordeal. Once a name was chosen, the woman was escorted to preparation rooms where 12 eunuch inspectors surrounded her like physicians of fate. Their task was not to heal, but to decide whether her womb deserved preservation. With clinical detachment, they examined her, asked chillingly simple questions, and determined whether she remained useful to the dynasty. Should the answer be no, her existence as a woman was essentially over. Medical procedures, forced sterilizations, or worse, awaited her. Should the answer be yes, she would proceed into the Sultan's presence with the weight of her future balanced on the fragile thread of conception. To fail at producing a child was to fail at survival, and each passing month of emptiness grew heavier until the day palace officials quietly removed her from her chamber, her disappearance explained away in records with the same sterile language that concealed thousands of vanished lives before her. What made this ritual so effective as an instrument of terror was its calculated unpredictability. The system was intentionally designed to appear random, so that no woman ever knew when her name might be called, no matter how long she had been in the palace or how often she had already faced the Sultan's gaze. It prevented rebellion by replacing despair with a flicker of hope, keeping the women trapped in a state of constant anticipation. They could neither resign themselves to safety nor collapse entirely into hopelessness, because the tray might summon them tomorrow. This unpredictability turned the women against one another, a twisted competition where rivals sabotaged menstrual records, spread rumors of impurity, or celebrated when a competitor was relocated to an unknown fate. The palace had no need to enforce unity among the captives, because the silver tray fractured it for them, ensuring that the women became instruments of their own oppression, complicit in a system that consumed them one by one. Foreign ambassadors who caught glimpses of this ritual were horrified, even though they came from cultures where burning witches and executing adulteresses was considered ordinary justice. They described the harem selection process as a spectacle of quiet brutality, where beauty and fear mingled in a way that seemed almost theatrical. Imagine standing in a hall adorned with gold and marble, hearing the footsteps of eunuchs echo like a death march, watching as a woman's name was drawn from a silver tray, knowing that she might never again be seen alive by her companions. Imagine the forced applause, the careful smiles, the hollow laughter that followed, all designed to conceal the truth that this was not romance but survival, not intimacy but institutionalized terror. Night after night, year after year, century after century, this ritual repeated itself until it became as much a part of palace life as prayers, banquets, and coronations. It was tradition, it was policy, and it was horror disguised as elegance. To reduce the nightly selection to mere cruelty would be to underestimate its depth. It was not only a system for controlling women, but also a psychological experiment in domination, perfected over generations. It revealed how human beings could be broken without chains, how luxury could serve as a mask for tyranny, how hope could be twisted into a weapon sharper than any sword. The women who survived this ritual did so not because they were stronger, but because they learned to hide their fear, to master their masks, to play the role expected of them until the silver tray passed them by for another night. Yet survival in such a world was never permanent. It was only ever a reprieve, a brief pause in a cycle of dread that ended the same way for nearly all. The tray would always return, the eunuchs would always walk the halls, the names would always be read, and for the women of the harem, every sunset was simply the prelude to another night of terror in the Sultan's palace. If the silver tray was the sharpest blade of terror in the Ottoman harem, then the second weapon, equally cruel but far more insidious, was the psychological battlefield it created among the women themselves. To imagine the harem as a unified sisterhood of captives suffering together is to misunderstand the very core of its design, because the palace administrators had mastered a principle far older than any empire: divide and rule. By keeping the women in a constant state of competition, suspicion, and jealousy, they ensured that rebellion never blossomed, solidarity never formed, and every victim became, in some small way, a collaborator in her own oppression. What unfolded inside those golden halls was not only a story of women crushed by the Sultan's system, but also of women turned against one another, clawing for survival in a game whose rules were written to destroy them. The structure of the harem was deliberately hierarchical, designed to ensure that every woman had someone above her to fear and someone below her to exploit. At the very bottom were the newest arrivals, often teenagers taken from villages or purchased in slave markets, still grieving for families they would never see again, their eyes wide with shock, their tongues stumbling over a language they did not yet know. They were the easiest prey, not only for the eunuchs who supervised their training, but also for the older women who quickly learned to assert dominance over them. A misplaced word, a poorly executed bow, or even a trembling glance at the wrong moment could result in humiliation, punishment, or worse. The middle ranks were composed of women who had survived long enough to be hardened, who understood that kindness could be a liability and that the only path to endurance was to suppress empathy. They became watchful, calculating, recording the cycles of their rivals, whispering secrets to eunuchs, and forging alliances that could collapse overnight. At the very top sat the senior concubines, favorites of the Sultan, and above them the Valide Sultan, who functioned as the supreme matriarch, wielding more power than most men in the empire. But even she was not truly safe, for her authority depended on the life and favor of her son, and in the swirling tides of palace intrigue, even the most powerful could fall in an instant. The psychological torment of this system lay not only in the fear of death, but in the transformation of natural human bonds into weapons of survival. Friendship was dangerous, love suicidal, and even sisterhood poisoned by rivalry. A woman might whisper encouragement to her companion by day, but by night report her to the eunuchs for a suspected impurity or forbidden affair. Rumors became currency, gossip became daggers, and betrayal was often the only insurance of safety. Palace documents and ambassadorial reports speak of women sabotaging rivals by slipping herbs into their meals to disrupt their cycles, hiding garments to cause lateness during inspections, or planting false whispers about supposed misconduct. These acts were not born of inherent malice, but of a system that rewarded cruelty and punished compassion. To resist was to vanish, but to comply was to survive another day. In such an environment, morality became irrelevant, and survival became the only law that mattered. The constant atmosphere of suspicion created a slow, grinding erosion of the mind. Women lived not only under the gaze of the Sultan and the eunuchs, but under the gaze of one another, their every move scrutinized by potential rivals. Privacy was non-existent. Chambers were searched, letters intercepted, diaries confiscated. A single word spoken in confidence could resurface months later as evidence in a fabricated accusation. The sense of isolation was total. Even within crowds, a woman could never feel safe, for the very faces she dined with, studied with, and slept beside could be the ones plotting her downfall. Over time, this cultivated a psychological fracture that modern historians describe as institutional paranoia, a condition where fear of others became so ingrained that trust ceased to exist altogether. The palace did not need bars or shackles, because the women themselves became each other's wardens, turning their cage into a labyrinth of invisible chains. What makes this psychological torture even more horrifying is that it often outlasted the physical suffering. A strangulation ended in seconds, a drowning within minutes, but the mental torment could last years, decades even, breaking women so completely that they lost all sense of self. Survivors' accounts, rare though they are, describe women who no longer remembered their original names, who forgot the sound of their native languages, who could not recall the faces of their parents. They became hollow vessels, filled only with the roles the palace had forced upon them. Some learned to embrace the mask so deeply that they became indistinguishable from their captors, enforcing rules, punishing rivals, and perpetuating the same cruelty they once feared. The transformation from victim to oppressor was not only common, but expected. In fact, it was the very mechanism by which the system sustained itself across centuries. The harem did not simply consume women's bodies. It consumed their identities, their empathy, and their capacity for genuine connection, until nothing remained but shadows and silk. The silent wars inside the harem were not merely personal, they were political. Every woman's survival depended not just on her own standing, but on the fortunes of her children, particularly her sons. To secure a future prince was to secure temporary safety, but to raise a prince too promising was to invite disaster. Women plotted not only against each other but against their own children's rivals, whispering poison into the sultan's ear, fabricating conspiracies, and manipulating court officials to eliminate threats. The stakes were unimaginably high because succession in the Ottoman Empire was not guaranteed by primogeniture, but decided by politics, by intrigue, and ultimately by the sultan's favor. A concubine who succeeded in elevating her son might live in luxury for years, but a concubine whose son fell from grace often followed him into the grave. Thus the harem became a battlefield where women fought wars not with swords but with words, not with armies but with rumors, and where the victors were not celebrated but merely survived until the next battle began. In this way, the harem's greatest cruelty was not simply its executions or its punishments, but its ability to destroy trust and turn every relationship into a weapon. By forcing women into endless competition, the palace ensured that no rebellion could take root, no solidarity could thrive, and no collective resistance could ever emerge. The women became both prisoners and jailers, both victims and accomplices, both sufferers and perpetrators of the very cruelty they despised. This was the genius of the system, not merely to dominate bodies but to dominate minds, to take natural bonds of sisterhood and twist them into chains of suspicion. The result was a world where silence screamed louder than words, where glances carried daggers, and where the greatest torture was not always the silk cord around the neck, but the gnawing certainty that no one could be trusted, not even oneself. And in this endless shadow play of fear and betrayal, the harem revealed itself not only as a palace of nightmares, but as one of history's most chilling laboratories of psychological warfare. If the harem was a palace of silk and shadows by day, then by night it became something far darker, a factory of calculated death. Behind the ornate walls of Topkapi Palace, killing was not random, it was not spontaneous cruelty, but a standardized institution carefully refined over centuries. The Ottomans faced a peculiar dilemma. Their laws and traditions forbade the spilling of royal blood, yet the empire demanded constant disposal of women deemed impure, unworthy, or politically dangerous. The solution they devised was as efficient as it was horrifying. Methods of execution that left no visible marks, no messy traces, and no evidence beyond the silence of another vanished concubine. What emerged was a chilling marriage of beauty and brutality, a system in which strangulation cords were made of silk, death barges were built with black painted wood, and bureaucratic paperwork tracked each disappearance with the cold detachment of an accountant balancing ledgers. The harem was not only a prison, it was a slaughterhouse cloaked in luxury. The most infamous method of execution was strangulation by silk cord. Unlike the brutal public beheadings of Europe, the Ottomans prided themselves on their so-called clean deaths. The victims were informed at sunset that their time had come, giving them one long, torturous night to contemplate their end. At dawn, the Bostons, the imperial gardeners who doubled as executioners, would enter the chambers with a cord of twisted silk, strong enough to crush the breath in seconds, yet leaving no wounds to mar the flesh. Two men worked in tandem, one holding the victim still while the other pulled the cord tight. The act was swift, almost surgical, but the true torment lay in the hours before, when the condemned woman sat in silence, writing letters that would never be sent, praying to gods who no longer seemed to hear, knowing that the soft fabric she once wore in her hair would now become the noose around her throat. To the empire, this was not cruelty but efficiency, a way of disposing of human lives with precision and elegance, as though death itself had been civilized. Equally chilling was the punishment known as the sea sack. If a woman was found pregnant without the sultan's consent, or if whispers of disloyalty threatened the stability of the dynasty, she was sewn into a leather sack, sometimes with writhing cats included to create panic and ensure suffocation, and then dragged under cover of night to the Bosphorus. The black-painted barge that carried these women became a ghost ship, launched only on moonless nights to keep the horror unseen by the city. There, in predetermined spots where the currents were strongest, the sacks were tossed into the water, ensuring the bodies would be carried away into the Black Sea. Fishermen whispered of mermaid graveyards, stretches of water haunted by restless souls, refusing to cast their nets for fear of pulling up bones. For the palace administrators, however, it was a simple matter of logistics. The sea was free, the evidence vanished with the tides, and the books could be balanced without any troubling remains. Over 3,000 women met this fate between the 16th and 17th centuries, their names erased, their memories dissolved into salt water, their lives reduced to another line of expenditure in the empire's endless accounts. Not every punishment was violent in the physical sense. Some were worse because they allowed the victim to keep breathing while stripping away all meaning from her existence. Women deemed no longer useful were often sent to the Eski Saray, the Old Palace, a decaying structure on the outskirts of Istanbul that became known as a graveyard for the living. There, hundreds of discarded concubines lived out their remaining years in silence, cut off from the world, their voices muted, their stories forgotten. A French ambassador once described it as a marble tomb filled with living ghosts, where women created their own silent language because even speaking aloud was discouraged. To be banished, there was not to live, but to slowly dissolve, day after day into the shadows, until one's existence was no different from a faint memory etched into stone. Death by banishment was as final as any execution, only stretched across years instead of seconds. The chilling part of all this was the bureaucracy that underpinned the killing. The Ottomans documented everything with obsessive precision. Execution orders were signed, methods specified, and reasons catalogued in neat handwriting that made the destruction of human lives look like routine office work. A strangulation was recorded as sudden illness, a drowning as special relocation, a banishment as transfer of residence. The language was sterile, deliberately chosen to erase the horror behind it, to make the extraordinary appear ordinary. Even the executioners themselves were evaluated. If a strangulation took too long, they could be punished for unnecessary cruelty, as though the very act of ending a woman's life in less than a minute could ever be considered merciful. Murder, in this palace, was not chaos, it was administration. It had budgets, schedules, and performance reviews. It was horror transformed into policy, brutality transformed into routine. What makes this system so terrifying is not only the methods themselves, but the way they were rationalized. Religious scholars attached to the palace issued rulings that twisted sacred texts into justifications for murder. They declared that women who disrupted harmony spread corruption, and their elimination was therefore righteous. Pregnancy without permission was redefined as theft from the Sultan, as though a woman's body were nothing more than stolen property. Even poisoning, reserved for women of higher rank, was disguised as luxury. The condemned were given almond-flavored sherbet, sweet to the taste but laced with death. They drank their final moments from golden cups, deceived by the elegance of presentation even as poison coursed through their veins. Beauty and brutality were intertwined at every level, ensuring that the palace could kill without ever admitting it was killing. Perhaps the most haunting discoveries came centuries later, when renovations of the palace revealed what had long been whispered. Human remains sealed within walls, confirming that some women who attempted escape were entombed alive, erased not only from history but from memory itself. To walk through Topkapi today, as a tourist, is to stroll through hallways that were once filled with fear, to admire tiles that covered chambers where women awaited strangulation, to take photographs in gardens that were fertilized with human ash. The horror was not accidental. It was systematic. It was not hidden. It was bureaucratized. And that is why the harem must be remembered, not merely as a place of luxury and intrigue, but as one of the most chilling death factories the world has ever known, where women vanished not because of who they were, but because the system demanded they disappear. The Ottoman harem did not collapse because its cruelty was recognized, nor because the empire suddenly awakened to compassion. It ended only when the empire itself began to crumble, dragged down by wars, corruption, and the pressures of modernity. For centuries, the harem had been defended as tradition, as necessity, even as divine will. It was only when those defenses could no longer withstand the tides of reform and external scrutiny that the walls finally cracked. Yet even in its final decades, the system fought to preserve itself. Palace eunuchs staged revolts against reform. The Valid Sultan and senior concubines resisted change because it threatened their power. and clerics issued fatwas warning that abolishing the harem would anger God. In the mid-19th century, when Sultan Abdulmajid I introduced the Tanzimat reforms to modernize the empire, slavery was formally restricted, but the imperial harem was quietly exempted, shielded by the very rulers who benefited most from its existence. The horror did not end in a blaze of justice, but in a slow, reluctant erosion, its victims buried in silence long before the institution itself was dismantled. When the harem was finally dissolved in the early 20th century, after the Young Turk Revolution and the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, what remained was not justice but a sanitized memory. The palace was transformed into a museum, its chambers scrubbed of blood and sorrow, its halls repurposed as tourist attractions. Visitors marveled at the intricate tilework, the marble fountains, the jeweled ceilings, but the voices of the women who had lived and died there were reduced to whispers in the background. Guides spoke of concubines as mysterious figures of beauty, of romance and exotic love, rarely of violence or death. The systematic femicide that had consumed generations was edited out of the official story, replaced with tales of intrigue and elegance. The very walls that had witnessed strangulations and drownings now served as backdrops for photographs, and the gardens fertilized by human ash became playgrounds for tourists' imaginations. History had been not only rewritten but romanticized, turning one of the world's darkest prisons into a spectacle of nostalgia. The legacy of the harem lives on not only in architecture and tourism but in culture and media that continue to distort its reality. Popular television dramas in Turkey and abroad have depicted harem life as a soap opera of desire, jealousy, and luxury, where power struggles are framed as entertainment and suffering is softened into melodrama. Characters like Roxolana, who in reality navigated a nightmare by becoming a manipulator and orchestrator of death, are portrayed as heroines of romance. Silk, jewels, and intrigue dominate the narrative, while the strangulation cords, the drowning sacks, and the banishment chambers vanish conveniently from sight. This selective memory serves a purpose. It protects national pride, it preserves the illusion of cultural grandeur, and it allows societies to look at the empire's past without confronting the cost in human lives. But in doing so, it betrays the victims, silencing them once again, this time under the weight of fantasy rather than cords of silk. And yet, no matter how much the truth is buried, fragments of it continue to resurface. Archival documents detail execution orders and financial records for relocations that were anything but benign. Archaeological excavations inside Topkapi have uncovered bones sealed into walls, silent testimony to women who were erased not only from history but from memory. Forensic studies of mass graves near Istanbul confirm the rumors of the Bosphorus as a watery graveyard. Even the Ottoman bureaucratic obsession with record-keeping betrays them, because the ledgers they kept with such care reveal statistics too damning to ignore. Out of hundreds of women in the harem at any given time, only a handful lived to old age. For every celebrated story of a concubine who rose to power, hundreds of names vanish from the records, replaced with vague euphemisms like sudden illness, accident, or transfer. Numbers, stripped of humanity, tell the same story as the bones unearthed beneath the palace floors. This was not romance, it was industrialized disappearance. The true horror of the harem lies not only in what was done, but in what it teaches us about human systems of oppression. It shows how cruelty can be normalized when wrapped in tradition, how atrocity can be justified with religion, how bureaucracy can sanitize murder until it looks like administration. The harem was not run by monsters but by ordinary people, eunuchs who carried out their orders, clerics who signed fatwas, women who betrayed rivals to survive, and sultans who preferred not to dirty their hands with direct responsibility. Each piece of the machine operated smoothly, and in its smoothness lay the horror. It is a reminder that the greatest atrocities in history are not the work of isolated sadists, but of entire systems, polished to efficiency, capable of consuming countless lives while convincing themselves it was necessary, inevitable, even righteous. The harem is a warning that beauty and brutality can coexist, that elegance can mask terror, and that when human beings are reduced to property, the result is always horror. Today, when millions visit Topkapi Palace and marvel at its grandeur, few pause to reflect on the cost of its beauty. Every tile admired was once a silent witness to fear. Every garden path was once walked by women who prayed never to hear their names called at night. To remember the harem truthfully is not to indulge in morbid fascination, but to honor the memory of those whose lives were consumed by its system. It is to acknowledge that behind the glittering surface of history lie countless tragedies, and that forgetting them is a luxury the modern world cannot afford. Because while the Ottoman harem has vanished, the mentality that created it has not. Human trafficking still thrives. Forced marriages still exist. Women are still treated as property in many parts of the world, and bureaucracies still justify cruelty with sterile language. The Palace of Nightmares may have been demolished, but its blueprint lingers in human behavior, in institutions that sacrifice dignity for power, in traditions that excuse brutality, and in systems that normalize the unthinkable. And so, the legacy of the harem is not only a story of the past, but a mirror held up to the present. It forces us to ask uncomfortable questions about the societies we live in, about the injustices we ignore, about the traditions we defend, without asking what lies beneath them. The women of the harem cannot speak for themselves. Their voices were strangled centuries ago, their stories drowned in the Bosphorus, their memories entombed in stone. But their silence speaks through history, warning us that civilization and barbarity can exist side by side, that beauty can be built on suffering, that forgetting is the first step toward repetition. To walk through the harem today is to walk through a crime scene disguised as a palace. To tell its story honestly is to resist the temptation of romance and confront the reality of systematic horror. And to remember is to ensure that the Palace of Silk and Shadows remains what it should be, a relic of the past, studied but never repeated, a warning written in marble and blood. So if this history unsettled you, let it. If it disturbed you, let it disturb. Because only by feeling the weight of its horror can we carry forward its lesson. And if you want more untold truths that history tried to bury, then remember to like, share, and subscribe, so these voices are never silenced again.